This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Okay, we might get started, everyone. Well, welcome. It's a little bit daunting. Please come in. I have a suspicion people might trail in a little bit given it's the first session. So you're in statutory planning and planning law. Please come in. The theatre is a distinct and historical design, and I don't know what it's like right up there, but it's a little bit daunting for me here as well. But as I might have said in one of the announcements, the numbers jumped dramatically over the last week, and I had to scramble to find a place that would accommodate all of us, but I'm sure we'll do very well. Welcome to the subject, but I suspect also this might be one of the first lectures that many of you have had in the Masters of Urban Planning or another Masters level course. So a particular welcome to you if that is the case. And I always enjoy meeting people slowly over the time we spend in 12 or so weeks. As you can tell, the numbers are such that we're not all going to get to know each other in an absolute way. But we do generally have some good discussions, whether it's in this forum and or in another forum such as the Toots, which are after the lecture. So I'll sort of slowly work my way through things, but I can't really hear from all of you, but I might tell you a bit about myself. I'm an urban planner and urban designer. I did my undergraduate in Perth and a Master's at Newcastle on Tyne, that's in Northern England. And I've done a number of jobs as a planner or urban designer in Australia and some overseas, particularly in the UK where I did my Master's. And I've been in Melbourne since 1996 and practiced for some time in intercity redevelopment. And so a lot of what I'm telling you here is stuff I learned on the job in some ways, under a different planning scheme format, I might add, and that has evolved over time. And the firm I worked for was called Simon Justin Bialik, or SJB, although I've had a few other little jobs on the way through as well. So I'm keen to find out a little bit about you guys, and I won't hear from you all individually, but I'm just interested to understand the discipline grouping. So I suspect urban planning is probably the biggest of the proportions. So who's from urban planning? Okay, I'm sort of thinking you guys might be interested as well. And we're very welcoming of diversity, of course, by discipline. Who's from architecture? Generally not too many. Oh, there's none. We can say bad things about architects. Or they've read the play and decided not to out themselves at this point. No. Some of my best friends are architects. Or former architects, at least. So, urban design. We've usually got a smattering of urban designers. Excellent, welcome. Landscape architecture. Property. Oh, okay. Enthusiastic response. Engineering related things. Yep, a few there. Okay. I hate to say it. It sounds like I'm, finding difference. Other. Who's in the other category? Yeah. Do you mind telling me what that is? Environment. Oh, fantastic. Yep. Urban and cultural heritage at the master's level in our faculty? Yeah, great. Okay, so we've got a bit of a feel for ourselves, which is fantastic. Come in, guys. I know it's an unfamiliar bit of territory over here. And so what I'm going to do today is start us thinking on this beast, which is statutory planning and planning law. We'll have the traditional look through the subject guide, and then we'll do a bit of on-board exercise, as in on the board. And I've just realised this is chalk, which I absolutely hate using. It makes me feel all strange. Let's see if I can take it. Otherwise, I might use this document camera and write on a bit of paper. So that's what we want to do today, and then we'll try and finish kind of early so people can go and find their tute rooms and all those sorts of things and get to know each other in that setting. So the format of the classes this year is a little bit different. I was explaining to some people a few minutes ago that we previously, when we set up the Masters of Urban Planning in 2016, I was teaching a group of about 15 people in a seminar style, and now we're at a situation where if everyone comes to the lecture, we have about 166 people enrolled in this. So it's quite different now in the format to accommodate that. I think most of the key ideas still come through, but the way we talk about them and learn about them and the way we assess them has changed a little bit to accommodate the greater numbers. But I think we've slowly improved the subject over the years. So you've probably already picked up, of course, we've got the 2 hours of lecture or workshop or sort of big seminar. We'll certainly have a break about in the middle to stretch the legs and go to the loo or whatever you need. And then we've got the 1 hour tute. And hopefully we'll just keep that rhythm right the way through. So that's a bit different from last year. So the lectures I will put on the LMS, and maybe some of you discovered that last night or yesterday at some time. So I like to put them up in PDF form. You'll probably notice that I put them up in a few different of the formats, so you can write on top of them or however you want to do that. Yeah, I think that the others I'll talk about later. So are there any questions at this point? Because I'll sort of go through some background ideas to get the juices flowing, I suppose. But any questions or comments at this stage? Can you actually hear me? I feel like I'm projecting as if there's no speakers, but I think there are. No? Okay. If it's too loud, too soft, let me know. So let's go back to some fundamentals. What is a plan? And I've put some ideas about that up on the board there, and I find it very beneficial to go back to these fundamental questions. And people like Christy there probably remember, maybe, that I often go back to this in a range of different settings because it actually is not simple to really understand planning. And I'm going to be talking, or we're going to be talking about a particular form, which is statutory and legal planning. But that top definition up there, establishing a desired outcome and a means of causing that to come about, what might be a problem? What might be good and bad things about that statement or that attempt at a definition? Anyone want to comment on that? Just remember what they said in South Park. There's no dumb questions, just dumb people. It's a joke. It's a joke. I could be in trouble already. No. What might be problematic about that statement about urban planning? Because this is the kind of intuitive thing many people imagine is sort of at the fundament. Absolutely. Deciding what the future should look like is incredibly contested. So I think that's part A. Absolutely. Thank you. In the same spirit, actually bringing about a desired goal, if you could even determine what that was, is incredibly difficult. We're not the kings and queens of urban growth and change and heritage, etc. We are just one of the players, aren't we? As urban planners or urban designers or architects or property people. So it is already very clear that a simplistic view of urban planning is only part of what urban planning is, and that urban planning faces many, many challenges. So obviously we'll be thinking about that kind of challenge, but through the statutory planning lens when we go through this semester. So another definition I find quite useful is the one there by Hopkins, a decision that should be made in light of other concurrent or future decisions. This is not the whole story, but I find it's quite a useful way of thinking about planning's potentials and its problems, because it takes our mind towards the fact that there's a lot of different decisions going on, a lot of different people are making those decisions, some of whom are urban planners, and we are trying, in a sense, to steer the ship, or in fact Hopkins has an analogy of piloting a canoe through fast-running water. We're trying to get there, but there are all these other forces pushing us in different directions. So it's actually quite a good book because it gets right to the essence of these challenges of making and implementing urban plans. So, but what it does, I think this is really, really important, and particularly for the statutory planning world, is take us down to this fundamental idea and problem of the decision as absolutely central to a lot of what we do. How do we make the decision? What gives us power to do so? What might guide that decision making? How far does that legitimacy to make decisions extend for all the different parties in this framework? And of course then we've got all the different manifestations of plans. What might be some actual types of plan that we have? When we start off thinking, oh, it's a drawing of something, a master plan, for example. But are there different types of plans? Structural plan, like building and, you know, the physics and all that stuff is sorted out. Absolutely right, yep. Yeah, so we can do things at different scales and take different things into account. So at the precinct level, we sort of have general ideas of where activities go and where people and cars and bikes move around. That's absolutely right. Well, I won't torture you. Oh, yes, there's a lady there. Public open space, that's right. So we break it down by different activities, absolutely right. But to not torture you too much with what you might find an uncomfortable silence, but I actually quite enjoy, I better not reveal too much about myself, that we tend to think of it as the drawn plan, but in fact we might use economic mechanisms to plan. Now, we tend not to do that much in Australia and indeed Victoria, but it's still part of it. We use policies, we use laws, we use regulations, we use encouragements in various ways, and we might use design, we might use strategy. So these things all manifest in different ways. So just starting to think about how what we are doing is part of this overall puzzle of what planning can and can't do and what it should do. Okay, so we kind of covered this. How do we decide the future? How do we actually bring it about? And really, if we left with one thing we thought about and indeed talked about in the Tute a little bit, is how is this actually going on? What are all the potentials and possibilities of these different ways of doing urban planning? And I might just make a note, I'm using what is generally the catch-all phrase of urban planning, but from all these different definitions and all these different traditions and places you come from, of course, maybe in the States it can be called city planning sometimes. Sometimes when you go out to this wider scale, we call it regional planning. Perhaps it might be called urban planning in a more general sense, town planning in the UK case, and so forth. So when I'm using the term urban planning, I'm meaning, you know, the general broader description that we tend to use in Australia. Probably one of the big issues, of course, is this one here. How do we deal with individuals and collectives of different forms? And when I say individuals, sometimes it's an individual person, sometimes it's an individual corporation, an entity. A collective, it might be a community, it might be an entire nation, it might be a small community activist group, and so forth. So these desires to bring things about are always influenced in this complex of forces and goals and desires. So when we get to a document such as this, I've stopped actually getting the hard copy of this. This is the Planning and Environment Act, because it's getting thicker and they keep changing things. But I'll talk about how to get the latest and greatest of that soon. But this document is seeking to deal with these challenges in various ways, and we'll spend a lot of time. In fact, the whole semester is really trying to deal with all these challenges that we face in all the different manifestations of that. Okay. So what are we thinking about when we try to set out these desired futures, these goals that we might set? And I'm sure these are all very familiar to you, but I do think it's useful to set them out and think about them, particularly since as soon as you start working with a document like the Planning and Environment Act, you are confronted with the fact that they treat these different goals in quite particular ways. Certain statements are made, certain rules and thinking and decision-making processes are set out about these things. So please come in. Yeah. So we have these broad goals, and often it's just the three: environment, economic and social. Some of us like to include the cultural as well. And these are very high-level goals, and usually they sound entirely reasonable, but as soon as we try and work out what they mean, it becomes more challenging, of course. And we need to think at this macro, this wider level, and we need to go right down to the individual level. And oftentimes we're seeking these wonderful goals that allow us to have everything, but many times, of course, we find that perhaps financial markets win out over the environment or social justice or whatever. And we quickly become aware, and I'm sure you are already aware, that urban planning is never going to be value-free. In fact, I would argue it is meant to be based on achieving good value, ethics, social conscience kind of outcomes. And all of the wrangles and challenges of that we are seeking in this kind of subject, and in many others in the degree and in practice, to try and find the best resolutions through good decision-making processes. And I'll push this argument to you that for all the things planning does, usually it boils down to good decisions of various forms. So what are we dealing with here? Lots of different things going on in planning, and of course when you look at different places around the world, some things are within scope and some are outside scope. But I mean, I've just chosen very, very quickly here some of the things that have been going on recently and are long-standing issues. Things like wind farms. How does the planning system deal with them? So at the end of this subject, you will be able to go to a planning scheme and look at the Act, and if someone asked you, you could actually specifically tell them how we deal with wind farms in Victoria, as one example. How would we build a pipeline that was trying to pipe water a long distance across many, many different ownerships? the statutory planning system provides ways of doing that. Whether or not it's right is another set of questions, of course, and the planning system at least partly provides ways of trying to work that out. Desalination plants, and so forth. These are all often quite contentious issues and all kinds of implications. But the planning system, the Act and planning schemes, which I'll describe mainly next week, provide ways of thinking about that. And what essentially happens is that your planning system represents a kind of social an indication of what a particular place says about certain things. So something contentious like, I don't know, gambling or a nightclub, maybe it produces noise. Well, are they allowed? Where are they allowed? What are the conditions of that? The planning system is providing ways of understanding that. So I find this endlessly exciting, which is probably fortunate given what I do, because most of the time you will find an issue in the newspaper and there will be an absolutely fundamental urban planning, statutory planning basis to things that are going on. And sometimes the planning scheme's silent, but nowadays we've got a planning scheme that's about that thick for each municipality in Victoria, and generally speaking it will have something to say about what goes on a piece of land. So this is really important. What do we think about heritage sites? And it's interesting to think about what is heritage really? It's not actually the age of it necessarily, although they are often old. It is the values which we as a community, and it's not just one community, there are many communities, that we are putting on these things, cultural values, and often the planning scheme has a whole lot to say about the value, and in fact there are other acts as well as urban planning that put values on these things. This one's not far away if you know where the new law building is, near University Square. We had a lovely old heritage pub on that site, and the developers took it upon themselves to deliberately demolish it, knowing, and we know that they knew because they had had correspondence with the authorities, they decided to demolish it on a weekend. And they have now been taken to court and it's turned into a protracted debate. So, just one little example, although pretty important for that heritage site, but how we value things, how we value places. It doesn't have to be a building to have cultural heritage. Again, the planning system and other related systems will have plenty to say about that as well. Remnant bushland, farming, urban growth, where it goes, how well serviced that urban growth is, as in are there schools and infrastructure and transport. These are all impacted by these things. And then we get into some of the politics of this as well, where we see, and this is right back in 2007, the land supply. Now this has been going kind of forever in most places dealing with planning and growth, and one of the big drivers behind this is the desire for people to push economic development and to make money out of it, for people to have homes, and so on and so forth. And in Australian cities we have a long legacy of releasing land, often when it's not really ready to be released, and growth cycles and cycles of decline, and it still goes on. And there are, if you want to read a really interesting book about Melbourne's history of land release, Leonie Sandercock wrote a book called Cities for Sale, and she goes through a number of different time periods looking at the release of land, often in very corrupt ways, for certain landowners to make a huge amount of money, right back in the 1860s onwards, and a particular period in the 1880s and 1890s where developers were releasing land with no roads, no services, no schools. It was just a paddock. They had a notional lot that they'd bought. And indeed some of those still exist in weird ways through legacy heritage stuff. So trying to work out how much land supply, how much viable land still exists is an ongoing issue for most planning systems, and it's caught up in lots of politics. The politics of, like increased supply, so it pushes prices down. Does that really work? And the Australian dream of everyone buying a house and having a big mortgage, and the development sector being a big driver of the economy and keeping the whole process going because it's linked to building freeways and so forth. So many things, including this whole land supply issue, are incredibly and inherently political, as well as being in the planning system. Some years ago, I gave a talk where I talked about the politics of urban planning, and an older urban planner became quite angry at me for saying, if you admit that planning is political, we lose all of our credence as independent technical advisors. And I think he had a kind of point, but on the other hand, we need to recognise that a lot of what happens in cities, who wins, who loses, who's got services, where they are, is political. And we have to find a path between that. And the statutory planning system kind of does provide that to some extent by giving powers and decision processes. So it's a difficult and important area to tread. And I'm just realising I'll give a few minutes, Rick and Sarah, who I've lost in the crowd, we'll hear about that in a few minutes. But this suburban sprawl question is a big part of Melbourne's growth. It's not the whole story, of course. But we were getting headlines like this. Actually, we've had nearly 50 years of these headlines. Release more land, but people have more land. It's pretty much the same debate as build more big roads and freeways, we'll get rid of congestion. And by the way, you may sort of disagree with me politely, I hope. That I will give you some of my views on these things. It's pretty hard to find an urban planner who kind of doesn't agree that sprawl doesn't solve anything. And we had Minister Madden making a statement which sort of made everyone nearly fall off their chair. He said, I don't believe we will need to make an adjustment in the urban growth boundary beyond this one in my lifetime. Since then, there have been about 6 releases of more land, showing the naivety of a politician who probably should have known better because he was an architect, but sort of didn't have that in his mindset. And, since then it's just changed and changed. So, track forward a little bit more, Minister Guy releasing 60,000 land blocks. These are not small matters. There's a huge economic process going on behind all of this. Huge implication for homeowners and ordinary people. Huge implications for the environment and transport systems because the nature of that land that's being released has a certain characteristic. It's an ongoing story. How much land should we release? How much is enough? And we are in a context here in Australia, a particular Australian one, where we have national government very, very strongly linking ongoing economic growth, GDP being a big part of what they measure, with ongoing immigration. And it is unlikely that will go away. Governments want to keep that going. They're kind of addicted to it in some sense because it drives growth and they look good. And then we get down to the level of the city and we have to try and cope with it somehow. And now we're kind of getting grown-up city problems in Sydney and Melbourne in particular, and in Brisbane and that whole growth corridor, where there aren't easy fixes anymore. So we'll have a bit of a look at we won't spend a lot of time on the metropolitan planning system, but we'll touch on it a bit insofar as the statutory system deals with it. So let's stop there for a moment. I realise we've got a guest, Rick Clark, and I'll sort of go back to this, but I realise we better let Rick speak. Rick is from the Young Planners and still studying a few things at the moment, and then I'll ask Sarah to come and just to break up my sort of excitement that I get over talking about planning issues, and
it's pretty exciting.
Talk about student activities and young planners. So over to you, just for a few minutes. Huh?
Yeah, sure. My name's Rick. Thanks for having me, Alan. I'm from the Planning Institute of Australia. So we're the professional body for planners in Australia, and I'm here today to talk to you about the Victorian Young Planners Network. So that's a part of the of PIA that deals with planners who are students or in their first 5 years of their careers. And our goal is to help you to develop your career, your own professional development, and we do that in a range of different ways. So you're all doing if you're doing the Masters of Urban Planning, those of you who are doing that, you're doing a PIA accredited course, so by the time you graduate, you'll get an accreditation from PIA. But some of the activities that we do through the Victorian Young Planners Network to help you are networking, so we run a whole bunch of different networking events where you can meet people from all sorts of different parts of the industry. It's a very diverse industry and it's good to have lots of different contacts who do all sorts of different things. We have a mentorship program, so we put you in touch. We have a special one that we set up for students last year, and that will be running again this year. Starts up around mid-year, so we partner you up with someone who's been in the industry for around 5 to 10 years, and it's really good to have a chance to talk through any issues that you have, maybe transitioning into the workforce or even just progressing through your masters. These are people that have been through all that not too long ago and can give you a bit of advice. We have a lot of social events throughout the year, and our first one's coming up next week, Wednesday of week 2. That's the 7th of March at 6 p.m. We're having a social event at Glam Cocktail Bar in the CBD. We do some policy development activities, so speaking on behalf of the profession, writing submissions on policies, and we all have a chance to be involved with that. We're going to be operating in the industry in the future, and it's, I guess, incumbent upon us to help sort of shape how that happens and have a say on what we think planning should look like in the future. So everyone gets a chance to be involved with that. We publish a magazine, so I've got some copies of that if you guys want to have a look through that. I'll pop them down there so you can grab them. There's a few different editions there. So first come, first served there. And it is a membership organisation. It costs a bit of money, but we have a really good deal for students. So I think as a graduate, it's $330 for your membership, but as a student, it's only $75 for full-time students, so it's pretty good. So I've got some brochures here that have some of the benefits of being a member, so feel free to grab one of those. But if you don't want to become a member, you can still come along to our events. It's just a little bit more expensive. And you can also follow our Facebook page to keep up with what's happening. So it's the Victorian Young Planners Facebook page. So there's a national Young Planners one as well, but make sure you follow the Victorian Young Planners to keep up to date with the local events and policy development initiatives and mentorship programs and stuff that we're running. Thanks. That's all I've got today.
Thanks very much, Rick. Much appreciated. Thanks very much, Rick. There she is, Sarah, whose surname I don't know.
Hi, I'm Sarah Ross. I am part of MAST, the Melbourne Uni Planning Student Society, and it's your course society where you come from academic, career, social kind of outlets. We specifically tailor events to what you want, so if you want more academic events, we can host them and do extra supporting tutorials, or if you more wanted to meet more career people, or if you just want social events. We try to kind of combine that all together.
Great, thanks very much, Sarah. So, Sarah, is there a way you can contact all of the students, or would you like to do, in the first instance, to send it through the subject?
Yeah, great.
I'm just, so, because I fully support these activities. It really gets people into the profession. Yeah.
So we've got an email that's just like mumsinfo@gmail.com if you want to contact us directly. We've got a Facebook group, a Facebook page, you can just search Melbourne Uni Planning Student Society. When you sign up, you give us our email and then we'll email you about events, but then to start off with, I'll
Send me something. Okay, great. Okay, we might go for about another 10 minutes or so, then I'll give you a chance to stretch your legs and we'll then go for another 40 minutes or so after that. Is that okay? Yep, good, good. Can I just ask, I haven't taught in this room, is that door doing something weird? There's not a button somewhere or? Wow, okay, so let's just be aware of that and go through that way carefully. Yeah, I'll call the facilities people when we have a little break. But yeah, thanks, Rick. Okay, so I'm not really trying to go through the whole debate of land supply in this subject, but I raise this for a very specific reason, and that reason is that in Victoria we have a huge amount of pressure for growth. In most places in the Melbourne sort of greater metropolitan area. It kind of colours a lot of the stuff that goes on in the statutory planning system. So that context is kind of important. It's a big part of our economy. It's almost, you could say, part of the consciousness of residents to think about opposing change or developers wanting change and all these sorts of things. So this context is quite an important one of releasing and building on land. And of course, I fully acknowledge you can go to some places, say in Japan, where the growth is negative population growth, or some places in Scandinavia where the towns are just shrinking. So it's not universal, but it certainly colours what happens here. You know, there are a lot of issues that are around individual freedom and seeking one's own goals, contrasted with other people's rights or perceived rights. And this is obviously just a few days ago, a well-off landowner has tried to get a permit to put a helipad on top of a tower that he's developing. He didn't get a permit for that, based primarily on amenity of the surrounding area, as in it's really noisy and really disruptive, is one person's desire, because you know they're rich and they like doing what they want. Maybe there are important reasons for a business person to have a helipad, but you know, weighing things up, it's not worth it. So you know, this ethic actually of trying to balance these things off, again, is quite central to a lot of the challenges that urban planning faces. And so you'll find them again and again. And I would recommend to you, if you don't already, to read the newspapers or news feeds, etc., and try and, you know, be aware of what's going on. And perhaps in an exam question I might set, talking about contemporary issues, you would have things you could use to illustrate a point. You know, and so it would have a statutory basis, of course, but here's an example of one that actually happened. So keep yourself aware of what's going on. You know, you might have international examples, but probably for this subject, where we look mainly at local matters, and I looked at Constanza there because she reminded me to talk about this. Look for examples around Victoria and Melbourne. So that reminded me to talk a little bit about this subject. We mainly look, we have some tips of the hat to other places, but we mainly look at what's happening in Victoria and in one piece of legislation, our Act, but we also look at some other acts in Victoria, and we don't go international or even to other states of Australia too much. The reason is that, and I've tried this, it just becomes incredibly confusing very, very quickly. So we decided many years ago to make a call that will try and teach in a clear way Victorian statutory planning and planning law, And maybe a bit like learning a language, best to just stick with one at a time, or unless you're amazing, and I'm certainly not, learn one well, but then you've learnt how to learn a planning system and you'll go elsewhere. And certainly it's the case that many of our graduates go and work and practice in many places, whether it's Australia or overseas, but they've learnt one system, and you will find that there are many things that transfer across as a principle, but they are acted on in different variations overseas. So that's been a conscious decision. We also, on balance, realise if you're here, you want to know about the place that we're in, and there's examples all over the place, particularly say if you're in the Masters of Urban Planning, subjects you might be doing concurrently or later. This will all be a fantastic basis for those other subjects of study. So I just mention that because it's a conscious decision to get the most out of the subject. Another contemporary issue that's going on, and you might find quite productive to keep an eye on, is the Fisherman's Bend redevelopment site. And if you haven't been there, maybe if you get a chance, go and have a look, or maybe you'll look at it in other things that you study, or just when you're moving around the city. This is potentially an absolutely huge project, but one key thing happened, and it's fundamentally a statutory planning issue. The former Minister for Planning, whose name I won't mention, well, it's Mr. Guy, he decided to rezone the land overnight using Section 20, Part 4 of the Act, and suddenly increased the value of the land by millions and millions and millions of dollars. And it meant that it became incredibly difficult for government to secure sites for schools, for parks, for childcares, etc., to deal with the massive flooding issues, to deal with the fact that a lot of the ground is really quite hard to build on, particularly for high structures because it's silty and challenging underneath. So in one stroke of the pen, the Minister changed the parameters for an entire large site fundamentally, not just the cost, but the cost really makes a difference, and effectively lost the ability to capture value off that land. Kind of just gave the money to the people who owned it, who are already developers who are sniffing around anyway. So this stuff is really, really important. And now we're in a bit of a stalemate where the government is trying to work out now, different government, what to do. Very, very challenging. And just livability. This is a fundamental thing, isn't it? People live, work, go to school, grow up, get old, get ill, hopefully get better. You know, it happens in places, and livability is a big driver. I made a comment before, I think it's really relevant to this, that Melbourne is now in a position where we're getting big city issues. You know, when the transport system doesn't work, it really doesn't work. You know, you can't just expect to drive across the city randomly. And I say this quite intentionally, you know, having grown up in Perth, where you sort of just drive around without really thinking very hard about it, and then suddenly you're confronted, hey guys, you're confronted with the big city challenges. And so the statutory planning system is one of the ways we try to deal with this, but it might be said that in some ways the statutory planning system was a bit of a driver for the pickle that we're in, if only because it doesn't control everything. And there are other types of planning, such as metropolitan planning, that need to complement it or to work with it. So these issues are big issues, but they're also small issues. Will someone be looking straight into my dining room windows from a few metres away in that new development next door? You know, so we can go at a range of different scales about livability and just the ability to enjoy the amenity of a place. Of course, we've got a lot of environmental issues, and of course the statutory planning system has a lot to say about environmental matters, whether it's clearing of land or just the impacts on the environment. Often our legislation interacts with other legislation and regulation in that way. We'll have a look at that as well. And just what is an urban place like? have to admit I've been using this one for a few years now because I find it quite amusing. When I first saw this mobile phone tower thing, I thought, oh, that's terrible. And then I thought, actually, most of the time people won't notice it. And I thought, if I lived next door, though, and I had to look at it in my backyard, I'd hate it. So, you know, planning system kind of needs to take a stand on these things and make decisions about them. Now, we've got a whole range of different places that we live in. We have a whole line of regulations to try and moderate the kinds of places that we live in. And of course, you know, sometimes I worry that we're maybe a bit too fancy in terms of, this is Mexico, just happened to be, you know, so I can get the tax breaks from going on a field trip. Joking. But, you know, people live perfectly fine lives. It doesn't have to look fancy. On the other hand, you know, what are the fundamental underpinnings of how a place works? Now, I say this because I feel that there is a kind of, I'm not saying in this group, in our planning system, there can be a certain middle class set of assumptions about what good planning is and nicey things, but what about how we treat people? How do people, you know, what goods and bads come out of it for people in all kinds of manifestations? And this sort of really brought it home for me of how communities work and our role and our responsibility in those. Of course, where are we now? San Francisco, of course. You know, these are more easily digestible heritage values, aren't they? But I would say very quickly that this sort of, I'm not saying it's bad, but you know, the nicey ones are not the only heritage values out there. And in fact, our planning system interacts with other heritage values such as Indigenous land and other matters like that. Density, medium density, medium rise, etc. And then we just get down to individual rights. I think you can guess what country we're in when we see that. But should I be able to, if I chose, to paint my house that way? I own the land, I own the house. Should I be allowed to do it? You know, it's a tricky question, and it depends on context, of course, and place. And maybe the community's expectations. So the planning system's interacting with all of those in various ways. Sam Newman, if you're not familiar with Sam Newman, he's a former footballer and, how do we describe him, media personality. Has a certain character, and I think you can see there, that's Pamela Anderson's face on the structure. And I unfortunately don't have a photograph of this, but in the mouth part, that's a garage door that opens up and the cars go in and out. And maybe someone thought that was tasteful, I don't know. But should it be allowed? Is that good or bad? Is it stimulating and interesting, or is it a bit crass, or, you know? So again, depending where it is and what the planning scheme says under the power of the Act, these decisions are important. And certainly if you haven't been exposed to local opposition, it's amazing how seriously people can take these things. We're in Fitzroy, the cheese grater. That was a very contentious site a few years ago. Nowadays I look at it and think, why were people worried about it? You know, so it fits in with the feelings of the time, I think, as well, of what people think is acceptable. And of course we've got all these cultural and in some ways racial values on these things of how we treat certain things, and also certain values that are built into that. You know, the skipping girl, heritage neon sign. This is, sorry, for the Indigenous population in Sydney, of course, over the Opera House. Chinese heritage is actually a massive thing in Australia and in Melbourne with the gold rush, but often those values were just ignored at that time. So, you know, these things have meaning. Hopefully we're a lot better at that stuff nowadays. We're kind of playing catch up in many ways. And of course, we live in the context of Plan Melbourne, which is a metropolitan plan, and I'll take you to some of the points where the statutory system intersects, so to speak, with the metropolitan policy system. And it's not universally liked. That's, of course, a modified version where people are claiming, well, this metropolitan plan changes what we can do on our land, or lets other people do things we don't like. So there are always these values there as well. And then of course there's travel. Now we have a transport system that's actually a little bit separate in many ways to the planning system, and that can be kind of problematic. However, if you've been to the UK, you probably recognised fairly quickly, just from the look of cars and things, that we're in the UK, and this is called the Magic Roundabout, after the children's television show of the 1970s. But what you'll notice there, this is more a curiosity than statutory planning, I admit that, but got to keep things light and bright sometimes. These cars go in two directions. They go clockwise there, and then they go counterclockwise there. And I've accidentally driven through this when I was studying my masters without understanding any of that. Fortunately, I didn't have an accident. But really, I make a point, partly for fun. It has its own Facebook page. Second worst roundabout voted. This one's called the Plough Roundabout because there was a pub there. And so forth. You can look that up. Multi-directional roundabout. And the actual sign even calls it the Magic Roundabout. And this is probably a description of how I actually travelled through it unexpectedly. But people often put values on these things. Obviously had a bad experience with that one. Okay, but seriously, travel is very, very connected with land use planning, and in fact the statutory system in this state, in the other states of Australia as well, in that even if we're not really in control of the transport system in statutory planning, we store cars, we store bicycles, motorcycles, people walk to and from them. We have interfaces with the street, etc., that have a lot of implications for quality of life, amenity, efficiency, and so forth. And indeed, it's true that many big disputes in the statutory planning system actually revolve around cars and travel in some way. And I'll just point out the reason I have this photograph was that it was proposed that these be the only access point for people. This is some years ago when we were starting to try and use rear lanes to let people in and out. And these guys were trying to make that the primary access point, which seems absolutely insane, and the amenity of that is very questionable. And how do we coordinate? And we're in a country here, and I know many of you from overseas, where you actually can't tell that a whole lot of urban planning and other planning has been going on most of the time. Things sort of, even though we've got problems, they're kind of working. So the stormwater system usually works. There are usually services there for houses and apartments to connect onto, and so forth. But actually one of the roles of the urban planning system, along with many other systems, is simply to coordinate activity in a number of different ways. It's surprising how difficult that is to do and how time-consuming that is, and it's one of the reasons the planning system takes a fair while to get stuff done. Of course, and I'm about to finish and let you have a break in a minute, we live in the natural world, even if it's a modified natural world. The planning system has things to say about flooding and bushfire. Many ways, one of the failings that we have in this country is that often prior to any form of planning or even building control, we built our settlements around watercourses for convenience sake without any background data set of knowing. Sometimes people did from speaking to Indigenous populations, but huge investments are still very, very exposed to flood and fire and cyclone, etc. And the planning system plays a big part in modifying those risks of disaster and emergency. So, as the final comment before the break, we've got a statutory and legal system that facilitates and empowers the ability to plan. You can still plan without the planning system in this legal format, but it has very little force, particularly when we try to get people to do things they may not necessarily want to do, or vice versa, to stop them doing what they want to do. So the ability to actually make a plan, how that planning occurs, and the kind of outcome we get, much of it is to do with this statutory basis, and indeed all its failings and its limitations and its assumptions. So what we want to do in this 12 weeks is not just learn like a bureaucrat, and you know, I guess many planners are bureaucrats by necessity. We're not just learning the rules, but we're thinking critically about them, and I would encourage and indeed reward that, particularly in the exam, that you can offer a critical view of how it might be better, or the nature of the assumption that is being made in a certain part of the planning system. You guys, I hope, at some point in your future, will be in a position where maybe there's a review of the Act, whether it's here or another place where you go, and you would have something important to say about how to make things better and how planning is good and bad and what it doesn't do properly. We are in a profession. A profession is not just using the system, but rather actually having an intellectual component to the things we do that may be separate to government and other interests for the public good. So you will find the statutory system encourages often to look to that public good, and sometimes it seems to forget it a little bit as well. So if we have a 5-minute break, now I'll let you stretch your legs, go to the loo, etc. I don't know where the loos are, but there will be some. And let's start again. Well, how about we say no later than 25 past? It's a little bit hard to get in and out, particularly with that door. So we'll start again at 25 past, and we'll have a little review of the main fundamentals of the system. Thanks, guys. Oh, yeah. Hello, hello. Go for it. I think you'll find that's amps you're stealing.
Oh, sorry. Studying planning, not electrical engineering.
Physics person there. Amps or watts? Both of them. Now, this I haven't used a whiteboard or a green board.
You're gonna
for a very
have to
long
watch
time.
everyone cringe the whole time you're writing on it.
I wonder if actually I might try this. I might try a bit of paper. See if I can use that. I'll give it a go. Is this? Oh, you've got to switch that on first. Whoa. No, go for it. Document camera. Hi.
Hi, Lucas.
Hi, Lucas.
You put me onto LMS because I'm not enrolled.
No worries. Any movement at the station?
Well, I had to do a summer subject,
Yep.
and the final assignment is today. The board of examiners Wednesday. Hopefully,
Yep.
it comes on Friday of next week.
We'll
But
just stick with it.
I've got access, and
Yeah, sure.
I'll get to issue, and hopefully it's not too overcrowded. So,
Okay, I'll point you to one. There's one that's still filling up.
Yeah.
They're all kind of full. There's a gentleman called Leonardo, and he's wearing a blue shirt with 193 and black glasses.
mobile phone.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. If you can catch up with
follow
him,
him at the end of
yeah. Okay, guys, we might get started.
Thank you for that.
No worries.
Do you currently work at SJB?
No, I did. I've still got pretty strong links with those guys, though. Yeah.
One of my friends just got a job there.
Oh, nice. That's good to hear. Yeah, they're a good group. You know, family friendly and all
You work
good
in
things.
the planning or the design?
Planning. Yeah. No worries. Okay, guys. I'll go through the subject guide quite quickly, but I would ask that you read it carefully if you haven't already, because there are a few things in there that kind of set our mutual expectations. So let me just go through. You'll see, and you'll get to talk about this with the tutors now anyway, the lecture followed by a tut. We just try and keep that rhythm going. You will see here, and of course these are some readings. They're not very taxing, in fact, and that is deliberately the case. But I would say that by the end of semester, you should have read the entire book thoroughly and actually in a critical way that's not just rote learning, but to have something to say about the issues that Stephen Rowley has raised in the book. Okay, so we've deliberately tried to narrow how much you need to buy, etc., to one book, and we'll sequence our way through it with the expectation that while we don't cover everything in the tuts, you will continue to read the book. And that's one of the ways that you could be successful, is by having a wider view of the planning system and its, good and bad things, etc. You'll see also I've sequenced here worksheets. So that's next week. I'll have the first one prepared. These are Word documents that I write and send out to everyone or make available. It's intentionally a Word document because you can then add, change whatever you want to that. So you can actively use the worksheet to learn at your own speed. So some people might go through it fairly quickly if they've got a lot of background in stat planning. Others might have to work harder. This is my way of allowing people to sort of even out their background and experience. It's not assessed, but I can assure you, if you go through the worksheets, your ability to do the assignments and certainly the exam, it will really help that. So this is my way of not going through every single little statute here, or indeed even in the tutorials, but to allow you to know, if you make your way through those, you've got the basics. So in the tuts, it may be that you might go through a few questions with the tutors on a weekly basis, but there won't be time to sort of grind through all of them. Does that make sense? So that's a Word document that I'll make available. And you'll see in these first 6 weeks, I beg your pardon, we go through what I would term the skills of a statutory planner. Someone in a planning office who understands the planning scheme and the Act to do the main things. And I'll talk in the last section today about what those main things are. And then there is a transition from week 7 through 12 where we have lawyers coming in. It will probably be Andrew Walker, Adrian Finanzio and Barnaby Chessel, 3 well-known barristers in planning law, and we're still working out the case law and things, so we'll sequence that now. And those guys always have a bit of character, kind of interesting, and they will take you through the key legal principles with examples, so reinforce the first part, and then in the tutorials you'll focus mainly just on the case law itself, which is tribunal determinations. And we'll kind of have one thing to look at each week as we move through that. Okay, so the other thing, of course, is the assessment. And I won't go through them now. I'll start talking about assessment 1 next week in detail. But you can see there's 3 bits of assessment. Assignment 1, roughly halfway through the semester. That lets me know that everyone's okay. Hopefully I find out before that if someone's not okay. And that is simply to find out if you can read a planning scheme and know what it means. Core skill, actually, when you start in the planning office, usually. And then assignment 2 is a bit more complex, and it's the assessment of a planning proposal using the planning scheme and in the form that we would expect. So one of the good things about this subject is that you're learning the planning scheme, but you're actually getting quite useful workplace skills up front, and you can use them in all kinds of ways, critically or just to get work, etc. And then we have an exam. I don't set the date, it's set by central university processes, so it's sometime during the exam period. I sometimes ask for it to be earlier, mainly so we can all go on holidays, but also it takes a lot of time to do the marking, but I can't really influence it. So if you've been at Melbourne University before, you'll know they say do not make plans to be away or buy tickets or whatever during that exam period until the exam is set, because we can't change it. It's just a necessity of university life. So that's the subject in overview. Are there any questions about that? We'll keep coming back to things as we move through. Okay, silence is assent. In that case, we've got one more thing to do in this session, and we've got I'll try and finish at about 10 to, so you have time to wander and find and take a breather. Let's have a go. Oh, it's not switched on. There we are. Right. I thought I'd be working with whiteboards, and I thought, you know what, I won't use the chalk on a blackboard because it just irks me. So what we might do in this session is I'm going to find out a little bit of what people know in the room, and we're going to construct a bit of a map of the statutory planning system. I don't know if it'll work. I actually haven't done this before, but I was given the idea by a planning lawyer. So why don't I give it a try? I'm going to go through sort of three or four main things. One is what are the legal fundamentals, and we're going to project them up there from here. Who are the main players and actors? What are the main processes? And how does that turn into decisions of various kinds? So let's start off, and I'll interact with your answers. I don't know, I'm making it up. Who are the main actors in the Victorian planning system? Who do you think they might be? Property developers. Okay, now you're probably going to have to contend with my writing. The players. So we've got here... Okay. It went back to its original setting. Okay. So we've got developers. Now, who... And you guys aren't allowed to answer, because you know. What is a developer normally called, or what role do they play when they're interacting with the planning system usually? What do you think they're called? They are a stakeholder, but we give them a specific name. I'm just getting a feel for what people know. So, applicant. Bang on. Okay, so we've got developers / applicants here. Can you guys read that? I'll type it up later if it's too hard. Okay, so, what or who is another player in the planning system? I heard the minister there, absolutely. And I think someone else said something. Council, yep. Okay, so council. Now, and there was another comment as well, I think. Department of... Okay, we call that, our state government department is DELP, Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. Easy. Okay, so there's DELP. Okay. Now, council, oh, that's the autofocus, is it? Council is local government here. So I'm just making everyone sort of start. We'll go through this in detail again. But council plays two main roles in the planning system. Has anyone got any ideas? It's a role that's set out in the Act. I kind of don't expect anyone to know, but I'm just suggesting it. All right, so it sounds like that's the thing to set out right now. We have the responsible authority, as number one, and two is the planning authority. Okay, the reason I'm kind of labouring this point is that you will come up against that exact distinction again and again and again in the Act. Okay, so we'll come back to that as a key thing we're going to track across in the next 10 minutes. Who are the other players in this game? The public. Excellent. And they are often playing the role of objectors or submitters. Okay. Building this map, I'm going to do the same thing. We'll do the same thing again at the end of the 12 weeks. And you guys can tell me with details and section numbers from the Act, etc. It'll be fun, I can assure you. And you'll be able to show off to your friends. Say, well, section 12, what's that, you know? Okay, so who else is in this process? Who else is important? VCAT. And what does VCAT stand for? Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal. So they play a role that I'm going to talk about in a minute as a bit of an umpire. And there's a few roles in that umpire role, and that's my term, umpire. All right, who else is in this process? We're thinking of players. Victorian Planning Authority, I like it. You've been doing your work. Okay, so they play a role. Probably the most distinctive thing they do is think about precinct structure plans and land release, that kind of stuff on the edge. Okay. We've got VCAT. That's probably the main one. There's one remaining. I talked about one of the roles of urban planning is coordination. With whom do you think we would be coordinating much? No, you bang on the money. We call them referral authorities. So during a process, we'll go into detail, we refer things off to other agencies essentially to find out that we're in concordance, so we're not, stopping another agency doing what they need to do. So a classic example might be Vic Roads. When we want to modify access to a big road, we send it to them and they might say, no, you can't do it because that's a really busy road. If we had another lot of cars going in and out on that road, it would cause accidents and slow it down, etc. So that's just one example. So referral authorities. And as let's check my spelling there. That's why I have illegible writing. So as we go through, you will see that referral authorities are both empowered and are given responsibilities and prescribed and proscribed certain things basically out of the Act, but also in the planning scheme itself. And tracking right forward to the exam, for example, I'll expect you to know the dimensions of what that means in certain circumstances. All right, so I know that you're really keen to know the answer to this. What's the difference between the responsible authority and the planning authority, and why do we care? Yeah. So, that was just a small joke, guys. After you've been sleeping with the Act under your pillow for 12 weeks, it'll all just be right in there. So let's go to the next component, which is processes. So, probably the primary thing to think about, I wonder if I can stop that. Might work. Yeah. Okay, so one of the primary reasons that we distinguish between the responsible authority and the planning authority is that they do different things. And when you come down to it, most of the time we're either going through the process of permit applications, or planning scheme amendments. Essentially, the permit application is when someone wants to carry out an activity or to build or demolish or modify a structure, they apply for a permit. So there's a whole process set out in the Act about that. So we're not going to go into detail now, just getting you to think about that. The other key activity of the many, but if we break it into two main ones, is when we want to change the planning scheme. Different zoning, different policy provision, different decision criteria, whatever it might be. And we call that a planning scheme amendment. So these are fundamental processes and we do them all the time. There are some other processes that occur as well. Oh, missing a C there. Does anyone know some of those other processes that occur? You probably haven't had time to absorb all of those, but I'll list them out and just so you know that they're there and we're going to touch on them. One of them is amending a permit or even cancelling a permit. You might be extending a permit because permits have time limits, or you're applying to extend a permit. Enforcement. What do you think enforcement is in a planning scheme setting? Sounds kind of vicious, doesn't it? What would enforcement be, do you think? I heard of fines for what? For not complying with the planning scheme. So it could result in a fine, or it might just be the beginning of that process to get them to change something that they're starting to do prior to the fine, etc. So if we look at the Corkman Hotel example I provided earlier, enforcement action was taken against them, and that's a particular case of a pretty major problem that they've caused themselves there by not complying with the planning scheme. Okay, we have a process called declarations, which is essentially when we want to get guidance on something, like exactly what is this land use, so we can go through a process to get a declaration to learn that properly. And then there's a whole bunch of what I'll put as miscellaneous appeals, lots of little detailed things that go in the planning system. So we'll leave that one alone for the moment. Okay, so before we go on to how these processes play out, and we'll only spend another 5 or 10 minutes on this, underneath all of this are some fundamental legal matters. How do you think these terms are defined? Where do these terms come from? Planning and Environment Act. So if we just get that open, now I've just realised that I can put things underneath the document scanner there. I can just show you. here we are, and I'm assuming is that in focus, give or take. Section 13, responsible authority. Now, I don't propose to go through it in detail right now, but we can see this is a term that has force and a certain meaning because of the Act. So if someone actually said to you, oh, the responsible authority does that, and you say, well, does it? Is it? Well, where would you go? You go to the Planning Act. That's the source of truth. Okay? And what's underneath it there? Is that on the screen? What are the duties of a responsible authority? So part of being a good statutory planner is knowing, you don't have to kind of know everything, well, it helps to know a fair bit, I suppose, but you would know where to go to work something out, and you develop this habit or this practice of going back to the source of truth. And one of the starting points for that is usually the Act. So you don't have to learn the Act in its entirety, but you need to know certain things. And what are the duties of a responsible authority? And so on and so forth. So this is the practice and the habits that you develop in statutory planning. Okay, so the responsible authority processes permit applications, the planning authority is running the scheme amendments, and the foundation, the fundamental, is the Planning and Environment Act 1987 as amended. Okay, there are some other key acts, in fact there are many if you start going through them, but probably one of the other really important ones is the VCAT Act. That's the tribunal where we sort out mistakes, disputes, we define things if they're not properly defined, etc. And the planning schemes. And the planning schemes come into existence or have force from the head of power provided by the Planning and Environment Act. So I'm going to take you through in some detail planning schemes starting from tomorrow. But essentially, most of the decisions we're making, particularly in permit applications, derive from what the planning scheme says. Generally speaking, it's saying you can do that and you don't even need a permit, or you do need a permit, or you're not allowed to do that at all. Generally, it falls into those three categories as a starting point for the permits. We're going to drill down into that and think about what that really means. So let's have another look then. I'll run out of paper here. I was planning to do it on the board, but we'll survive. So these different players then go on to become decision makers, and I guess in some ways they run processes. And where do you reckon they get the rules for running the processes and making decisions? From the Planning Scheme and the Planning Act, that's right. So the Act generally sets out the different points at which people get to have a say and who decides and on what basis, and the details for that are set out in the Planning Scheme. Okay, and they run the process. So the responsible authority here is making decisions as the RA, as the responsible authority, on decisions on permits. Basically, can someone be allowed, for example, to demolish an historic pub? And they'll say yes with conditions, as in you have to do it this way, or no, you're not allowed to. Sometimes those decisions are kind of made already in the planning scheme because it's set out. Other times the responsible authority needs to exercise its discretion, which is another key thing we will go to. Okay, so what happens, that's starting to be a bit illegible, what happens after the responsible authority makes a decision and not everyone agrees? What if not everyone agrees about a responsible authority's decision? It can go to VCAT. Sometimes there's not an ability to go to VCAT, but if it's an instance where it is disputable through VCAT, it goes straight to VCAT. That's right. Well, not straight, it takes time. Okay? So VCAT then has the responsibility to make a decision, and effectively it stands in the shoes of the responsible authority. Okay, that's good. There's another process that can sometimes feel a bit contentious to people. If not everyone agrees, or it's a very contentious one, it can go to someone else. The minister. Okay, so sometimes the minister calls in decisions. And in fact, he or she may do that right from the start in many circumstances, if they were to see fit to do so. And usually it would have to be on the basis of it being of state significance, etc. Okay, so they can't just do it willy-nilly, but they'll have to decide whether it's appropriate. Okay, so they're the main points of the permit application process. We'll deal with this in a slightly less messy and more detailed way soon. But then we've got these planning schemes and we're amending them. So essentially the planning authority makes decisions on how to change, on amending the planning scheme. And I won't go into detail on them here, but there are a number of points at which the planning authority needs to make decisions. The decision to proceed with changing the planning scheme, the decision to exhibit, to take on the comments made through the exhibit process, to proceed and ask for a panel to be appointed, to take notice of what the panel said and so forth. So there are a lot of steps in that process, and on the whole, the planning authority takes responsibility for following that through, using the points set out in the Act, the decision points and all those criteria. And then, so then we get to planning panels, which is a body which has experts who run a panel process where people get to say what's good and bad and should be taken into account as to whether or not we decide to go forward with a scheme amendment. So that's planning panels. Okay, it goes back to the planning authority, and guess where the final say for a change to a planning scheme, a scheme amendment, would go? To the minister. Okay. Okay. Now these, I'm not describing here all of the processes, but as I said before, a lot of the processes that, what really consumes most of our time and all the resources of all the planners and in fact other people in local government related to planning is often these main processes. So I'll draw a bit of a wobbly line. Okay, so there's another umpire role that can be played. So VCAT is a kind of umpire in the planning permit process if it is taken to VCAT. There's another umpire role. Does anyone know what that one is? The Supreme Court. It's not used very often, but it can be on a matter of law in a planning decision, in the exercise of discretion. Okay, so again, we'll talk about that in a bit more detail as we go. They're relatively rare, but they can have significant implications in terms of how we make decisions in the planning system. The other one is VCAT, when there are questions of whether or not these processes are being undertaken properly according to the Act. Oh, don't know what happened there. There we are. Okay, and then along with these fundamentals, and I won't go through all of them here, there are some key legal concepts that we will look at that influence how judgments are made and how processes run and how discretion is exercised. For instance, ultra vires. Does anyone know? Oh, spell it right. Does anyone know what that means? It means outside of power. So if someone has acted in a way that is not within their proper powers set out in the Act or the planning scheme, they've acted outside their power. So it's a principle that we apply to things. A classic example might be if an applicant has applied for a development and we put conditions on his or her permit that relate to the use of the land, that would be considered ultra vires outside the powers. So we're going to look at some VCAT determinations that explain that principle and how it's applied. We have existing use rights. The name kind of has it in that within certain limits, if someone's already doing something on a piece of land and the planning scheme changes, most of the time they can't be made to stop doing that thing, in simple terms. So there are some principles to apply there as well. We'll talk about natural justice, which might be characterised as giving people a fair go. We'll talk about that. And dominant and ancillary uses, when there's more than one thing going on a piece of land. Okay, you'll be relieved to know that's all I've got on that. So I'll just scan that and put it online. I did that in that slightly painful way to find out what you know already, but also to just talk it through and move through it fairly slowly. We will run a similar exercise at the end of semester, and I'll want you guys firing stuff back to me and explaining all the nuance of that. And you'll be surprised how much you know by the end. It's actually pretty amazing. And how useful you will be as a planner getting jobs and doing stuff, or you might be an activist, whatever you want to do. It's really, really powerful. So I'm drawing to a close, but are there things people wanted to ask at this point before you go to tutorials? Okay, well thank you very much. We'll get into it next week and enjoy the tutorials. Thanks guys. Yes, so the PowerPoint's online, the lecture's recorded, and if I write things, I upload them on board as well, so it's on there. How are you? Good to see you. Yeah, your face is familiar, I can't think where from, but you're advances. Thank you so much for joining us. I don't know if you all yours. Perfect.
Changed a little bit since I did it like that.
Yeah, it's good. That's a good one, isn't it? Yeah, that is the right one, isn't it? That's the right one. Yeah, good. Yeah, but I can take that one.
Yeah.
That's one I did at home.
Thank you so much.
It'll all become, in the next few weeks, it'll all fit together.
Thank you.
How are you? Are you finding it too much? Yeah, good.
I already get from the library, so...
Yeah, great.
And one thing about our tomorrow's meeting,
Yes.
maybe I send the email a bit late tonight.
As long as you can do it, that's fine.
Yes, so I'm going to send April and everyone.
Okay. Don't stay up too late. We're here for the long run, huh? Yeah. Yeah, great.
It's going to be more about the
Did you want-
physical application.
Did you want to photograph that? Yeah.
We'll see.
The what? Oh, open book exam. Ah. Okay, can I make a note to send to everybody on that? I'll send an email to everybody about that. Yeah, to make that clear. Thank you. Normally I would have said something, so yeah, no worries.
You come across
So you're okay, you know where your building is and all that stuff? Yeah, great. Fantastic, yeah.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's really good. So you're sort of able to build a skill set out of all of this. So